Picture this: a world where winter isn't just a season. It's a living, breathing force that shapes every heartbeat, every breath, every quiet moment of survival. What if I told you that for centuries, entire families lived through months of blizzards inside nothing more than carefully arranged buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles? How did they do it? What did it feel like when the wind howled across endless plains and your only shelter was a cone of hide that seemed impossibly fragile against nature's fury? Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. I treasure seeing how far our circle of time travelers reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're traveling to the northern Great Plains of the late 1700s and early 1800s, where the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet peoples developed survival methods so refined, so perfectly adapted to brutal conditions, that they could call a frozen landscape home for months at a time. Close your eyes and imagine yourself there, where the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, where the sky meets earth in a seamless line of white, and where the only sounds are the whisper of wind through dried grass and the distant crack of ice forming on shallow streams. You wake before dawn in the heart of winter, somewhere on the northern Great Plains in the year 1820. The darkness is absolute, thick and cold as black water. Above you, the curved walls of the tipi rise like the ribs of some great sleeping animal, and already you can hear the soft patter of snow beginning to fall again. It's been falling for 3 days now. Your breath fogs in the air as you lie perfectly still, listening. The fire at the center of your shelter has burned down to glowing coals, casting faint orange shadows that dance across the hide walls. Somewhere near your feet, your younger sister shifts in her sleep, pulling the buffalo robe closer around her small shoulders. The sound she makes is barely audible, a soft sigh that mingles with the constant whisper of wind outside. This is how every winter morning begins for you. In the quiet space between sleep and wakefulness, you take inventory of your body. Your fingers are stiff, your toes numb, despite the thick fur slippers your grandmother made for you last autumn. The ground beneath your sleeping robes feels like stone, frozen earth that no amount of layered hides can completely soften. You can feel the cold seeping upward, a slow, steady drain on your body's warmth that never quite stops, not even in sleep. But you don't move yet. Movement means disturbing the careful cocoon of warm air you've trapped beneath your robes during the night. Movement means facing the day's endless list of tasks that must be completed, despite the cold, despite the wind, despite the way your hands shake when you try to work with anything smaller than a lodgepole. Outside you can hear the camp beginning to stir. The soft shuffle of moccasins on snow. The quiet murmur of your aunt's voice as she speaks to her infant son, words too low to understand, but soothing in their rhythm. Somewhere across the circle of lodges, someone is feeding their fire, and you can hear the gentle crackle as dry wood catches flame. You know you must rise soon. Your mother will expect you to help with the morning meal, to check on the horses, to gather what little firewood might be found in this treeless expanse. But for now, you lie still and listen to the snow tapping against the hide walls like tiny, insistent fingers. The teepee around you is a marvel of engineering, though you've never thought of it that way. To you, it's simply home, 12 buffalo hides sewn together with sinew, stretched over 15 carefully selected lodge poles that your father cut from the pine forests far to the west. The hides overlap in a pattern your mother learned from her mother, each seam placed precisely to shed water and wind. Near the top, 2 flaps can be adjusted to control the smoke from your fire, and around the bottom edge, additional hides create a liner that traps warm air close to the ground. But on mornings like this, when the temperature has dropped so low that your breath crystallizes instantly in the air, even this sophisticated shelter feels impossibly fragile. The wind finds every tiny gap in the hide covering, every place where the materials have shrunk in the cold. It whispers through these spaces with a sound like distant voices, a constant reminder of the vast frozen world that surrounds your small circle of warmth. You finally force yourself to move, pushing back the heavy buffalo robe that has been your cocoon. The air hits your face like a physical blow, so cold it makes your eyes water instantly. You sit up slowly, careful not to wake your sister, and reach for the bundle of clothes you arranged beside your sleeping place the night before. Everything is stiff with cold, your leather leggings, your wool trade blanket, even the beadwork on your winter moccasins feels brittle beneath your fingers. Dressing is an art form in weather like this. You move quickly but deliberately, pulling on layers in a practiced sequence. First, the soft doeskin shirt that sits closest to your skin, then the wool blanket that a trader gave your father in exchange for beaver pelts. Over this, a buffalo robe with the fur turned inward, and finally, your winter moccasins, double-soled and stuffed with dried grass for insulation. Each piece of clothing tells a story of survival. The doeskin was prepared by your mother during the warm months, scraped and softened with endless patience. The trade blanket came from far to the east, carried along paths that connected your people to merchants in St. Louis and beyond. The buffalo robe is from an animal your uncle killed just before the first snows, when the herd still grazed within a day's ride of camp. Now fully dressed, you turn your attention to the fire. The coals glow like tiny suns in the darkness, but they need fuel to become flame again. You reach for the neat pile of buffalo chips and dried wood scraps that your family gathered yesterday, selecting pieces with the care of someone who knows that each bit of fuel must last. Wood is precious here on the plains, where trees grow only along distant riverbanks, and every stick must be carried on travois during the constant movements of camp life. You feed the fire slowly, gently, coaxing it back to life with small twigs and dried grass. As the flames begin to dance, light spreads across the interior of the tipi, revealing the ordered world your family has created within this small space. Along the curved walls, your possessions hang from the lodge poles, medicine bundles wrapped in red cloth, your father's war shield, extra moccasins, bags of pemmican, and dried berries. Everything has its place, everything serves a purpose in the ongoing battle against cold and hunger. The fire grows stronger, and with it comes a slight increase in warmth, though you know it will take hours for the interior of the tipi to become truly comfortable. You can see your breath still, white puffs that dissipate slowly in the rising warm air. But this is luxury compared to the world outside, where the temperature has dropped so low that spit freezes before it hits the ground. Your mother stirs now, waking with the silence of long practice. She doesn't speak. Sound carries far in the cold, thin air, and the camp values quiet in these early morning hours. Instead, she simply nods at you and begins her own careful process of dressing and preparing for the day. Her movements are economical, each gesture refined by decades of winter mornings, just like this one. Together you begin the morning routine that will be repeated in tipis throughout the camp. Water must be fetched from the stream if it hasn't frozen completely. Horses must be checked, their winter coats brushed free of ice and snow. The constant work of maintaining your shelter must continue, retightening guy ropes that have contracted in the cold, checking the hide covering for new tears or weak spots, adjusting the smoke flaps to account for the changing wind. But first, breakfast. Your mother unwraps a bundle of pemmican, that concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that serves as the foundation of winter nutrition. She slices it carefully with a sharp knife, each piece measured to provide sustenance without waste. There might be a small portion of dried corn as well, obtained through trade with the Earth Lodge peoples to the south, or perhaps some dried squash that the women prepared during the harvest season. You eat slowly, savoring each bite, not for its flavor. Pemmican is functional food, not delicious food, but for the way it begins to warm your body from the inside. The fat provides quick energy, the protein sustains strength for the day's work ahead. This might be your largest meal until evening, depending on how much food the hunters were able to find during their recent expeditions. As you eat, you can hear the sounds of the camp awakening around you. Children's voices, still thick with sleep. The soft whinny of horses as they paw through snow to reach the dried grass beneath. The distant sound of someone chopping wood with steady, rhythmic strokes. These are the sounds of survival, of a community that has learned to work together against conditions that would defeat individuals. Soon it will be time to venture outside to face the full reality of winter on the Great Plains. The wind will hit you like a living thing, probing for any gap in your clothing, any exposed skin it can attack. Your eyes will water, your cheeks will burn, your hands will grow numb despite your mittens. You will understand in a way that no modern person can truly comprehend what it means to live at the mercy of the natural world. But for now, for just a few more minutes, you sit in the growing warmth of your family's fire and prepare yourself mentally for another day of survival. Outside, the snow continues to fall, adding to the drifts that already reach halfway up the sides of the tipis. The wind continues to howl across the endless expanse of prairie, carrying with it the promise of more cold, more snow, more long nights huddled around fires that must never be allowed to die. You finish your pemmican and stand, feeling the stiffness in your joints that comes from sleeping on frozen ground. Your sister stirs now, and you help her with the complex process of dressing for winter weather. She is young enough still to whimper at the cold, and you make soft shushing sounds as you wrap her in her small buffalo robe. Your mother watches approvingly. The care of children is everyone's responsibility during the winter months, when survival depends on the health and strength of every person in the camp. The fire burns more strongly now, casting dancing shadows on the teepee walls. Outside, you can hear your father's voice as he talks with your uncle about the day's plans. The hunters will venture out again, following animal tracks in the snow, hoping to find deer or elk that might supplement the dwindling stores of buffalo meat. The women will continue their endless work of maintaining the camp, repairing equipment, caring for children, preparing what food there is. And you will take your place in this ancient rhythm of survival, adding your efforts to the collective struggle against winter's relentless assault. Your hands may be numb, your feet may ache with cold, your stomach may never feel quite full, but you are alive and your people are alive, and that is victory enough in a world where the margin between life and death can be as thin as a buffalo hide stretched against the wind. The morning routine continues, each task performed with the careful attention that winter demands. There is no room for carelessness when the temperature hovers far below freezing and the nearest help might be hundreds of miles away. Every action must be deliberate, every decision weighed against the constant calculus of survival. As the light outside grows stronger, though light is a relative term on this grey, snow-filled morning, you prepare to step outside and begin another day in a world where survival is not guaranteed, where each sunrise represents a small victory over forces that seem determined to reclaim the prairie for ice and wind and eternal cold. But this is your world, the only world you've ever known, and in its harsh beauty, in the stark simplicity of its demands, there is a kind of peace that more comfortable peoples might never understand. You are about to discover what it truly means to be human in the face of winter's awesome power, to find warmth and meaning in the smallest gestures of care and survival. As the first pale light of dawn filters through the snow clouds, let us drift from your morning struggle to another story, one that echoes across the generations like wind through dried grass. Her name was Eagle Woman, though the Lakota called her Matho Wichashte, and her life spanned nearly 70 winters on these same plains where you've just awakened to the bite of frozen air. The name itself carried weight among her people, for eagles were messengers between the earth and sky, creatures that could soar above the immediate concerns of daily life and see patterns invisible from the ground. Those who knew Eagle Woman understood that she had inherited something of this gift, the ability to perceive connections and possibilities that others missed, to navigate between different worlds with the same grace that eagles move between earth and heaven. Born around 1820, when the buffalo herds still moved like dark rivers across the prairie, Eagle Woman learned the art of winter survival, not from books or theories, but from the patient teaching of grandmothers whose hands had guided her people through countless blizzards. These were women whose knowledge had been tested against the harsh realities of prairie winters for generations, whose understanding of weather patterns, food preservation, and community survival had been refined through centuries of experience on these unforgiving plains. Her grandmother, Washte Wing, had been present at Eagle Woman's birth during a particularly severe winter storm, and the old woman always claimed that the timing of her arrival, in the midst of a blizzard that tested the entire band's survival skills, was an omen of the role she would play in her people's future. The storm had lasted 4 days, and Eagle Woman's first cries had mingled with the howling wind in a way that made the attending women exchange meaningful glances. She grew up in a world where survival wasn't just personal, it was communal, woven into the fabric of relationships that stretched across tribal boundaries and deep into the heart of the continent itself. The Lakota understanding of survival encompassed not merely the individual's ability to endure hardship, but the entire network of obligations, reciprocities, and shared knowledge that allowed communities to persist across generations of challenges. From her earliest memories, Eagle Woman had been immersed in this complex web of interdependence. She learned to read not just the weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, but also the social weather of her community, the subtle tensions that could develop between families, the ways that pride and need could create dangerous conflicts, the delicate negotiations required to maintain harmony when resources were scarce and survival margins thin. Her education in these matters came through countless hours spent listening to the conversations of her elders, watching how disputes were resolved and alliances formed, observing the intricate protocols that governed everything from the distribution of meat after a successful hunt to the arrangement of lodges in the winter camp. She learned that leadership among her people was not a matter of commanding others, but of serving as a focal point for the collective wisdom of the community. Picture her as a young woman in the winter of 1845, standing at the entrance of her family's tipi as another storm builds on the northern horizon. She is 25 years old, already recognized as someone with the rare gift of moving between worlds, speaking not only Lakota, but also the languages of the Cheyenne, the Arikara, the fur traders who come up the Missouri River with their boats full of goods from the distant eastern cities. Her linguistic abilities had developed naturally through the complex networks of trade and intermarriage that connected the various peoples of the northern plains. As a child, she had spent summers in camps where multiple languages could be heard around the fires each evening, where the ability to understand different ways of expressing ideas about everything, from horse breeding to spiritual ceremonies, was not merely useful but essential for navigating the social landscape. But her gift extended far beyond simple translation. Eagle Woman possessed what her people recognized as a rare ability to understand the deeper currents of meaning that flowed beneath surface conversations. She could sense when a Cheyenne delegation's formal requests for trade goods masked deeper concerns about territorial boundaries. She could hear in an Arikara chief's casual comments about weather patterns the encoded information about enemy movements that might affect her own people's safety. Her ability to translate more than words, to bridge the spaces between different ways of understanding the world, has made her valuable to her people in ways that go far beyond simple conversation. The fur traders, with their strange customs and incomprehensible motivations, had become an increasingly important factor in the plains economy, but they remained largely mysterious to most native peoples. Eagle Woman had spent enough time around trading posts and river camps to understand something of their thinking, their peculiar obsession with the accumulation of goods that seemed to have no connection to immediate survival needs. This knowledge had already proved useful in several delicate negotiations. The previous summer, when a dispute had arisen over the payment for a large shipment of buffalo robes, Eagle Woman had been able to navigate between the traders' insistence on their written contracts, marks on paper that meant nothing to most of her people, and her band's understanding that agreements were sealed through ceremony and maintained through ongoing relationships of mutual respect. The storm she watches approach is one that will be remembered for generations, a blizzard so fierce it will be spoken of in the winter counts, those pictographic records that mark the passage of years with symbols of significant events. The winter counts served as both historical record and mnemonic device, each pictograph carefully chosen to evoke not just the event itself, but the web of circumstances surrounding it. The symbol for this winter would show wind lines and snow, but those who knew the full story would remember the human dramas that played out against the backdrop of natural fury. But Eagle Woman doesn't know this yet. All she can see is the wall of grey-white cloud rolling toward their winter camp like a living thing, swallowing the horizon as it comes. The cloud formation has a particular quality that speaks to her trained eye, a density and uniformity that suggests not just a passing storm, but a sustained siege of weather that could last for days. The air pressure has been dropping steadily for hours, creating the peculiar stillness that often precedes the most dangerous blizzards. She observes, too, the behavior of the animals around the camp. The horses have been increasingly restless throughout the day, clustering together and turning their backs to the north wind in the instinctive positioning that conserves body heat. The camp dogs, normally boisterous and scattered throughout the circle of lodges, have sought shelter beneath the raised edges of tipis and in the lee of equipment piles. Even the ravens, those hardy scavengers that usually brave the worst weather, have disappeared entirely, a sign that experienced plains dwellers know to take seriously. Her husband, a respected warrior whose medicine bundle hangs from the lodge poles behind her, has been gone for 6 days now with a hunting party. They rode south, following rumors of elk in the protected valleys along the White River, taking with them some of the camp's strongest horses and most of its remaining ammunition for the few precious firearms the band possessed. These rifles, obtained through trade and raid over the years, represented both a significant military advantage and a dangerous dependency on the white man's goods and technology. The hunting party had left camp with high expectations, driven by reports from Brûlé relatives who had encountered a substantial elk herd wintering in the sheltered coulees where mineral springs kept the water flowing even in the coldest weather. Elk meat would provide not only immediate sustenance but also the raw materials for winter clothing and tools. The thick hides could be worked into winter moccasins and leggings that would resist the penetrating cold of prairie blizzards. The antlers and bones could be fashioned into implements that would serve the band throughout the coming year. In normal times, 6 days would not be cause for concern. Hunting parties often stayed out for weeks, following game across vast distances, establishing temporary camps when they encountered promising hunting grounds. The men were experienced travelers who knew how to read weather signs and find shelter when conditions turned dangerous. They carried with them the accumulated wisdom of generations of plains hunters, knowledge that had allowed their ancestors to survive and thrive in this demanding environment for countless generations. But these are not normal times. The rhythm of life on the plains has been changing in subtle but profound ways that create new uncertainties and dangers. The previous summer's hunt had been disappointing, yielding far less meat and fewer hides than the band required for comfortable winter survival. The buffalo herds, those vast collections of animals that had sustained the plains, peoples for countless generations, had seemed smaller, more scattered, harder to predict in their movements. The buffalo, washi chung in the Lakota language, were more than just a source of food and materials. They were the foundation of an entire way of life. Every part of the animal served a purpose: meat for immediate consumption and long-term storage, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools and ornaments, sinew for thread and bowstrings, even the dried dung for fuel on the treeless plains. The annual buffalo hunt was not merely an economic activity, but a sacred undertaking that connected the people to the spiritual forces that governed their world. Some of the elders spoke of the increasing numbers of white settlers moving along the river roads, of the steamboats that churned up and down the Missouri, carrying ever more people into lands that had once seen only native travelers. These newcomers brought with them strange ideas about land ownership and resource use that conflicted fundamentally with native understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. Where the Lakota saw a complex web of relationships in which humans, animals, and the land itself were bound together in networks of mutual obligation, the whites seemed to perceive only resources to be extracted and territories to be claimed. The animals, they said, were being pushed away from their traditional ranges, forced into unfamiliar territory where they were harder to find and more dangerous to hunt. Buffalo that had followed the same migration routes for generations were now avoiding areas where white settlements had been established, creating unpredictable gaps in hunting patterns that had sustained the plains peoples for centuries. The disruption of these ancient rhythms created not just practical difficulties, but spiritual unease, a sense that the fundamental order of the world was shifting in ways that threatened everything familiar. Now, with winter tightening its grip and the hunters overdue, Eagle Woman finds herself in a position that will define much of her later life, serving as a bridge between survival and catastrophe, between the old certainties and the new uncertainties that are beginning to reshape her world. This role of mediator and crisis manager has been thrust upon her, partly by circumstances and partly by her own growing reputation for wisdom and reliability in difficult situations. The responsibility weighs heavily on her shoulders as she surveys the camp and takes mental inventory of its resources and vulnerabilities. She knows the status of every family which have adequate food stores, which are running short, which have sick or elderly members who will require extra care during a prolonged storm. This knowledge represents years of careful observation and relationship building, the patient work of someone who understands that survival often depends on the strength of community bonds forged in calmer times. She turns back into the tipi, where her 2 young children sleep beneath heavy robes. The lodge itself represents countless hours of women's work, buffalo hides carefully selected, processed, and sewn together with the skill that makes the difference between adequate shelter and protection, capable of withstanding the worst prairie weather. The interior arrangement reflects both practical necessity and cultural tradition. Sleeping areas positioned to maximize warmth from the central fire, storage spaces organized for quick access to essential items, sacred objects placed according to protocols that connect the family to the spiritual forces that govern their world. Her daughter, barely walking, makes soft sounds in her sleep, and Eagle Woman adjusts the child's coverings with the automatic care of motherhood. The little girl has been her constant companion during the long days while her husband has been away, and Eagle Woman has found herself explaining the world to someone too young to understand the complexities, but old enough to sense the undercurrents of tension that have marked the recent weeks. Children, she has observed, often perceive emotional atmospheres more clearly than adults, responding to anxieties and hopes that their elders try to mask. Her son, older at 4 years, has inherited his father's restless nature, and even in sleep seems poised to spring into action. The boy has been asking increasingly sophisticated questions about his father's absence, about the likelihood of successful hunting, about the preparations his mother has been making for what she clearly expects to be a difficult winter. Eagle Woman has tried to answer these questions honestly while preserving the security that children need, walking the fine line between preparing him for hardship and frightening him unnecessarily. Both children have known only the security of their parents' careful provision, but Eagle Woman can count the remaining bundles of dried meat hanging from the lodge poles, can calculate how long their food will last if the storm proves as severe as the signs suggest. The mathematics of survival admit no comfortable margins for error. Each meal consumed brings the family closer to the edge of genuine hunger, and the return of the hunting party represents not just the hope of reunion, but the difference between adequate nutrition and the slow starvation that can weaken people enough to make them vulnerable to the diseases that stalk winter camps. The meat bundles themselves represent a complex chain of labor and skill. The summer hunt had yielded enough buffalo to provide some security, but not the abundance that would allow the band to face winter with confidence. Each strip of dried meat hanging from the lodge poles had been carefully cut, seasoned with wild herbs, and slowly cured over smoking fires tended by women whose expertise in food preservation could mean the difference between life and death for their families. The work had continued for days after each successful hunt, women laboring in the heat and smoke to transform fresh meat into the concentrated nutrition that would sustain their people through the months when hunting became difficult or impossible. The wind begins to pick up outside, that low, moaning sound that seems to come from the earth itself. This is not the sharp whistle of a passing squall, but the deep, continuous sound that experienced plains dwellers recognize as the voice of a major storm system. The sound carries across the winter landscape like a warning, growing steadily louder as the front approaches the camp. Eagle Woman has heard this sound countless times before, but tonight it carries an urgency that makes her pause in her work. She is preparing winter moccasins, carefully sewing thick buffalo hide soles to soft deerskin uppers, adding layers of dried grass for insulation. The work requires not just skill, but the kind of precise attention that can only come from understanding exactly how these items will be used. The thickness of the sole must be calibrated to provide protection from frozen ground, while still allowing the wearer to feel the terrain beneath their feet. The height of the upper must be sufficient to keep snow out while not restricting the movement necessary for winter travel. Her hands move with the rhythm of long practice, each stitch placed with precision born of necessity. These moccasins might mean the difference between life and death if someone is forced to travel in the deep snow. She has seen men lose toes to frostbite because their footwear was inadequately prepared, has known families who suffered terribly because they had not anticipated the specific demands that severe weather would place on their equipment. The sinew thread she uses has been carefully prepared from the back tendons of buffalo, processed to provide the strength and flexibility necessary for winter gear. Each piece of thread represents hours of work, the initial harvesting and cleaning, the slow process of separating individual fibers, the treatment with plant extracts that prevent the thread from becoming brittle in extreme cold. Nothing in the creation of essential survival gear can be left to chance or approximation. As she works, she listens to the sounds of the camp around her. 23 tipis arranged in the traditional circle, housing perhaps 150 people, ranging from infants to elders whose memories reach back to the time before white traders appeared on the rivers. The circular arrangement is not arbitrary but reflects deep cultural understanding of how communities can best protect themselves against both physical and spiritual dangers. The opening of the circle faces east, toward the source of light and renewal. The placement of individual lodges within the circle reflects complex protocols of kinship, status, and spiritual responsibility. The sounds that drift across the camp in the growing wind tell their own story to ears trained to interpret them. The quiet conversations from neighboring teepees as families make their own preparations for the storm. The occasional whinny of horses as the herd presses closer to the camp, seeking shelter. The rustle of lodge covers as the rising wind tests every seam and tie point. These are the normal sounds of a winter camp preparing for severe weather, but Eagle Woman listens beneath them for the subtler indicators of problems that might require her attention. She knows each family's situation, who has sufficient food stores, who might be running short, which children have been coughing in the cold, which elders struggle most with the aches that winter brings to aging bones. This knowledge is not casual gossip, but vital intelligence that could determine how the community survives the storm that is approaching. In the interconnected world of the winter camp, the weakness of any individual family becomes a potential threat to the security of the entire group. The elderly present particular challenges during severe weather. Their bodies no longer generate heat as efficiently as those of younger people, and they often suffer from ailments that make it difficult for them to maintain the activity level necessary to stay warm. Yet these same elders represent irreplaceable repositories of knowledge and experience. They are the ones who remember previous storms of similar severity, who know the traditional remedies for cold-related illnesses, who can provide the spiritual guidance that helps communities maintain their cohesion during times of crisis. Eagle Woman has already begun the quiet calculations that will occupy much of her adult life, balancing resources, negotiating needs, finding ways to ensure that the most vulnerable members of the community make it through the hardest times. These calculations involve not just material resources, but social and emotional ones as well. The maintenance of morale during a prolonged storm can be as crucial as the conservation of food. The preservation of hope can determine whether people continue to make the effort necessary for survival or surrender to the despair that often proves more deadly than cold or hunger. The children of the camp present their own complex set of needs and opportunities. They require more food relative to their body weight than adults, and they are more vulnerable to the diseases that can spread rapidly through confined communities. But they also possess reserves of energy and optimism that can help sustain adult morale during the most difficult periods. Eagle Woman knows that keeping the children engaged and hopeful will be crucial to maintaining the emotional climate necessary for community survival. The first snow begins to fall just after sunset, large flakes that drift down with deceptive gentleness. To an inexperienced observer, these first flakes might seem benign, even beautiful in their lazy descent through the still air. But Eagle Woman knows the signs, the sudden stillness in the air that precedes the most violent winds, the way the horses cluster together near the camp, seeking shelter from what is coming. The particular quality of light, a strange, metallic glow that seems to drain color from the landscape, that experienced plains dwellers recognize as the harbinger of dangerous storms. The temperature has been dropping steadily throughout the day, but now the decline accelerates as the snow begins to accumulate. Each flake that reaches the ground adds to an insulating layer that will soon become both protection and trap for everything beneath it. The snow will provide some shelter for the camp, creating windbreaks around the tipis and helping to seal small gaps in the lodge covers, but it will also make movement difficult or impossible, cutting the camp off from outside resources and trapping everyone within the narrow confines of their individual shelters. Eagle Woman sets aside her sewing and begins to prepare for what might be days of confinement within the fragile walls of hide and wood. The preparations she makes now will determine not just her own family's comfort, but their very survival, and she approaches each task with the methodical attention of someone who understands that overlooking any detail could have fatal consequences. Water is the first concern. Once the storm truly begins, it will be impossible to reach the stream that provides the camp with fresh water. The stream, fed by springs that keep it flowing even in the coldest weather, is located perhaps 100 yards from the edge of the camp, normally an easy walk, but potentially a death trap in blizzard conditions. People have been known to become lost and freeze to death within yards of safety when visibility drops to zero and wind removes all auditory landmarks. Eagle Woman fills every available container, parfleshes lined with pitch to make them watertight, clay pots obtained through trade with Pueblo peoples far to the south who possessed ceramic technology unknown to the plains tribes, even the cleaned bladders of animals that can serve as emergency water storage. Each container represents not just storage capacity, but cultural connection, the product of trade networks and relationships that stretch across the continent. The parfleshes, made from buffalo rawhide and decorated with geometric patterns that carry both aesthetic and spiritual significance, can hold several gallons of water when properly sealed. The pitch lining, obtained from pine trees in the distant mountains through trade with Western tribes, must be maintained carefully to prevent leaking. Even small cracks in the lining can render a container useless, and Eagle Woman inspects each parfleche carefully before filling it. She melts snow in iron kettles, another product of trade with the white world, and carefully stores the result in vessels that can be kept close to the fire to prevent freezing. The iron kettles represent a significant technological advance over traditional skin containers, allowing water to be heated more efficiently and reducing the risk of contamination. But they also represent a dangerous dependency on goods that can only be obtained through trade with outsiders, whose reliability remains questionable. The process of melting snow for water is more complex than it might appear. Snow contains far less water by volume than ice, requiring large quantities of snow to produce relatively small amounts of water. The melting must be done carefully to avoid scorching, which can impart an unpleasant taste that makes the water difficult to drink. Fresh snow produces the cleanest water, but once a storm begins, the snow available near the camp may become contaminated with dirt, ash, and other debris blown about by high winds. Food comes next. She inventories their winter supplies with the methodical attention of someone who understands that mathematics can be a matter of life and death. The calculations involved are complex, taking into account not just the quantity of food available, but its nutritional value, its storage requirements, and the rate at which different family members will consume it under various stress conditions. Pemmican prepared from the previous summer's hunt represents the most concentrated nutrition available to the family, enough for perhaps 2 weeks if carefully rationed. This mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries provides the high-energy sustenance necessary for maintaining body heat and strength during periods of extreme cold. The preparation of pemmican requires considerable skill and experience. The meat must be dried to exactly the right consistency to prevent spoilage while maintaining palatability. The fat must be rendered and added in precise proportions to provide energy without making the mixture rancid. The berries add not just flavor, but essential nutrients that help prevent the nutritional deficiency diseases that can weaken people during long winters. Dried berries collected during the brief abundance of autumn represent another crucial resource. Choke cherries, plums, and grapes gathered from river bottoms and carefully dried provide vitamins and minerals that cannot be obtained from meat alone. The berries also add variety to a winter diet that can become monotonously centered on preserved meat. But perhaps most importantly, they provide the psychological comfort of sweetness and flavor that can help maintain morale during periods of deprivation. A small quantity of corn obtained through trade with the Earth Lodge peoples who practice agriculture along the Missouri River adds carbohydrates to supplement the high-protein diet of meat and pemmican. The corn, carefully dried and stored in sealed containers, can be ground into meal for making a kind of porridge that provides filling nutrition when meat supplies run low. The agricultural peoples who grew this corn possessed knowledge and skills that complemented those of the nomadic hunting peoples, creating trade relationships that benefited both groups. Some dried squash, its storage representing hours of careful work by the women of her extended family, provides additional variety and nutrition. The squash had been sliced into long spirals and slowly dried over fires until it reached the leathery consistency that allows for long-term storage without spoilage. Like the corn, the squash represents not just food, but the extensive network of relationships that allows different peoples to share their specialized knowledge and product. But it is not just the quantity of food that concerns her, it is its distribution. Eagle Woman knows which families in the camp are running short of provisions, which have sick members who need extra nourishment, which have lost providers to accident or warfare, and depend on the generosity of their neighbors. The approaching storm will test not just individual preparation, but the entire network of relationships that holds the community together. The distribution of resources within the camp follows complex protocols that balance individual family needs against community survival. Families with successful hunters are expected to share with those less fortunate, but this sharing must be done in ways that preserve the dignity and autonomy of those receiving help. Direct charity can create resentment and social tension that weakens the community's ability to function effectively. The most successful resource-sharing strategies are those that create ongoing relationships of mutual obligation rather than simple one-way transfers. As the wind increases and the snow begins to fall more heavily, Eagle Woman makes a decision that will be remembered long after the storm has passed. She bundles herself in her heaviest robes and ventures out into the growing blizzard, moving from tipi to tipi in a careful circuit of the camp. This decision represents considerable personal risk. People have died in similar storms while traveling much shorter distances, but Eagle Woman's understanding of her role in the community makes the risk acceptable. The robes she wraps around herself represent months of women's work and generations of accumulated knowledge about survival in extreme conditions. The outer layer consists of buffalo hide, carefully tanned and treated to repel moisture while retaining flexibility in cold temperatures. Beneath this, layers of softer deer and elk hide provide insulation while allowing freedom of movement. The arrangement of these layers, the way they are secured to prevent gaps where cold air might penetrate, the selection of materials based on their specific properties, all of this represents a technology as sophisticated as any produced by more settled peoples. To those families with abundant supplies, she speaks quietly of neighbors who might be in need. These conversations require considerable diplomatic skill, as they must communicate the urgency of the situation without seeming to criticize the generosity of those being asked to help. The families with surplus resources are usually those whose hunters have been most successful, or whose women have been most skilled in food preservation, and they take justified pride in their preparations. To suggest that their neighbors' lesser preparations might become their responsibility can be perceived as an unfair burden. Eagle Woman approaches these conversations by emphasizing the interconnected nature of community survival. She reminds people that the strength of the entire group depends on ensuring that no individual family becomes weak enough to represent a danger to others. She speaks of the unpredictability of fortune, of how even the most successful families might find themselves in need during future crises. She invokes the spiritual teachings that emphasize the importance of generosity and mutual aid as fundamental virtues that connect people to the sacred forces that govern their world. To those families running short of food or fuel, she offers what reassurance she can while making mental notes of what help they might require. These conversations are even more delicate than those with the well-supplied families, as they must provide hope and practical assistance without undermining the pride and independence that allow people to maintain their psychological strength during difficult times. The families running short of supplies often include those headed by elderly people whose hunting abilities have declined, women whose husbands have been killed or are away on long trading expeditions, and those who have suffered recent losses due to accident or illness. Each family's situation requires a different approach. The elderly hunters might be reminded of past years when they were the ones providing assistance to others. The women alone might be offered help in terms that emphasize their roles as specialists in tasks that require skills their helpers lack. Those suffering from recent losses might be approached as people who are temporarily weakened, but who retain the capacity to recover and eventually reciprocate assistance. This is dangerous work in more ways than one. The storm is intensifying rapidly, and already the familiar landmarks of the camp are becoming obscured by blowing snow. The circle of tipis that Eagle Woman has known since childhood, each lodge positioned according to protocols she learned as a girl, begins to disappear into a uniform whiteness that eliminates all visual reference points. The lodge poles that normally provide reliable navigation markers fade into the swirling snow, and even the sounds that usually help orient a person within the camp are muffled by the wind and the accumulating precipitation. The temperature is dropping fast, and Eagle Woman can feel the cold probing for gaps in her clothing, seeking to drain the warmth from her body. Each breath she takes burns her lungs with the dry cold that can freeze human tissue within minutes of exposure. Her face, the only part of her body that cannot be completely covered if she is to see and speak, begins to ache with the particular pain that warns of approaching frostbite. But more dangerous still is the delicate social negotiation she is conducting. To offer help too directly might shame a proud family, creating resentment that could persist long after the immediate crisis has passed, and potentially weakening the social bonds that make community survival possible. The Plains cultures place enormous emphasis on personal autonomy and dignity, and even well-intentioned assistance can be perceived as condescending charity if it is not offered with appropriate sensitivity. To be too indirect might leave genuine needs unmet, allowing preventable suffering that could weaken individual families and, by extension, the entire community. The challenge is to find the middle ground where help can be offered and accepted in ways that preserve everyone's dignity while ensuring that actual needs are addressed. This requires not just knowledge of each family's specific situation, but deep understanding of the personalities and sensitivities of the individuals involved. She moves through the camp like a spider tending her web, strengthening the connections that will allow the entire community to survive what is coming. This metaphor captures something essential about Eagle Woman's approach to community leadership. Like a spider, she understands that her own survival depends on the integrity of the entire structure she helps maintain. Like a spider's web, the community's strength comes not from any single strong element, but from the countless small connections between all of its parts. At the tipi of her husband's brother, she finds that their youngest child has developed the harsh cough that sometimes precedes the lung sickness that can kill children in winter. The sound of the child's breathing, audible even over the growing wind, carries the distinctive quality that experienced mothers learn to recognize as a warning of serious illness. Lung sickness, probably pneumonia, though the Lakota understanding of the condition focuses more on symptoms and treatment than on the underlying biological mechanisms that cause it, represents one of the most serious threats to children during severe weather. Without being asked, she produces a small bundle of medicinal herbs, plants gathered during the summer and carefully dried and stored against just such emergencies. The bundle contains a mixture of plants selected for their ability to ease breathing and fight the internal fires that consume people suffering from lung diseases. Wild cherry bark for suppressing coughs, willow bark for reducing fever, sage for its purifying properties, and other plants whose medicinal uses have been refined through generations of experimentation and observation. The preparation and storage of medicinal plants requires specialized knowledge that Eagle Woman has acquired through years of apprenticeship to the women healers of her band. Each plant must be gathered at the proper time of year when its medicinal properties are at their peak. The drying and storage must be done carefully to preserve the active components that make the plants effective. The combinations of different plants for treating specific conditions represent accumulated wisdom that has been tested against real human suffering and refined through countless cases of illness and recovery. Her gift of medicine to her brother-in-law's family is offered in the casual manner that allows it to be accepted without creating an obligation that might be difficult to repay. She mentions that she has more of these plants than her own family is likely to need, and that they will lose their potency if not used soon. This fiction allows the receiving family to accept the gift as a favor to the giver rather than as charity, preserving their dignity while ensuring that their sick child receives treatment. At another lodge, she discovers that the family's supply of buffalo chips for fuel is running dangerously low. Buffalo dung, dried by sun and wind into combustible chips, represents the primary fuel source on the treeless plains. A winter storm that lasts several days can require enormous quantities of fuel to maintain the fires necessary for warmth, cooking, and light. The men of this household are away with the hunting party, and the woman left behind has been too proud to ask for help gathering the fuel supplies that their family's survival might depend on. The collection of buffalo chips is traditionally work that can be done by anyone capable of walking and carrying, but it requires considerable time and effort to accumulate the quantities necessary for winter survival. A single family might need several tons of dried dung to fuel their fires throughout the cold months, and the collection of this material represents hours of labor that must be completed during the brief periods when weather conditions allow outdoor work. Eagle Woman mentions casually that her own family has more fuel than they need, and would the woman be doing her a favor by taking some off her hands? This approach allows both women to maintain their dignity while addressing a genuine need. The fiction that the well-supplied family has excess fuel that needs to be disposed of transforms what could be perceived as charity into a mutually beneficial exchange. The receiving family gets the fuel they need, while the giving family gets the satisfaction of helping without appearing to judge their neighbor's preparations. By the time she completes her circuit and returns to her own teepee, the storm has reached full fury. The wind howls across the prairie with a sound like continuous thunder, driving snow horizontally across the camp with such force that individual flakes become invisible in the white chaos. The air fills with a mixture of falling snow and ground snow, lifted and hurled by winds that seem to come from every direction at once. The familiar shapes of the other lodges have disappeared into a world of white motion, and Eagle Woman knows that for the next several days, perhaps for as long as a week, the camp will be cut off from the outside world as completely as if it existed on another planet. The storm has transformed the familiar landscape into an alien environment where normal rules of navigation and survival no longer apply. People have been known to become lost and die within yards of their own homes during blizzards of this intensity. Inside her teepee, the children have awakened and huddle close to the fire, their eyes wide with the mixture of excitement and fear that storms bring to the young. The contrast between the chaos outside and the warm security of the lodge interior creates a sense of sanctuary that Eagle Woman works to maintain through her own calm demeanor. Children take their emotional cues from the adults around them, and her ability to project confidence and control will influence how her family experiences the crisis. Eagle Woman settles beside them, pulling them close to her warmth, and begins to tell them stories, not the dramatic tales of heroes and monsters that are saved for summer gatherings, but the quiet, repetitive stories that help time pass during long confinements, stories that weave together wisdom about survival with the gentle rhythm that helps children sleep despite the chaos outside. The stories she chooses are carefully selected for their psychological effect as well as their cultural content. In the confined space of the storm-bound teepee, with uncertainty about the future weighing on everyone's minds, the stories serve multiple functions. They provide distraction from immediate fears and discomforts. They reinforce cultural values and survival knowledge that the children will need throughout their lives. They create a sense of continuity with previous generations who survived similar challenges, and they establish the rhythmic, hypnotic atmosphere that helps people endure long periods of forced inactivity. She tells them about the first people and how they learned to read the signs that predict weather. These stories, passed down through generations of storytellers, contain practical information about meteorology encoded in mythological narratives. The children learn to recognize the cloud formations that predict severe storms, the wind patterns that indicate changing weather, the behavior of animals that serves as an early warning system for dangerous conditions. But the stories contain deeper lessons as well. They teach that the natural world operates according to patterns that can be understood and predicted by those who pay careful attention. They emphasize the importance of learning from the experiences of previous generations, of respecting the wisdom that has been tested against real hardship and proven reliable across countless seasons of challenge and survival. She speaks of the animals and their winter strategies, how the buffalo grow thick coats and cluster together for warmth, creating the living windbreaks that allow entire herds to survive on the open plains, even during the most severe blizzards. The buffalo's winter behavior provides a model for human communities, demonstrating how individual survival depends on collective cooperation and mutual protection, how the wolves hunt in coordinated packs that can bring down prey much larger than themselves, sharing the responsibility for providing food and caring for the young in ways that ensure no individual wolf bears the full burden of survival. The wolf pack, like the human band, succeeds through the careful distribution of roles and responsibilities, through communication and coordination that allows the group to accomplish what no individual could achieve alone. How even the smallest birds know to seek shelter in the thick growth along stream banks when storms approach, understanding instinctively that survival sometimes requires accepting temporary confinement in exchange for protection from forces too powerful to be faced directly. The bird's wisdom reminds the children that there is no shame in seeking shelter, that the strongest creatures are often those who know when to yield to circumstances beyond their control. As she speaks, the storm outside reaches a peak of intensity that seems to shake the very earth. The teepee walls bend inward under the force of the wind, the carefully constructed framework of poles groaning under stresses that test every joint and lashing. Snow finds its way through gaps in the hide covering, despite all the careful preparations, creating small drifts inside the lodge that must be constantly swept away to prevent them from melting and creating puddles around the fire. The sound of the wind becomes a constant presence, not just noise, but a physical force that seems to press against the eardrums and vibrate through the ground itself. The children press closer to Eagle Woman, seeking comfort not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming sensory assault of the storm. She continues her quiet storytelling, her voice providing an anchor of human warmth and continuity in a world that seems to have been taken over by elemental chaos. The fire flickers and dances as gusts of wind come down through the smoke hole, and Eagle Woman finds herself constantly tending the flames, feeding them with the careful attention that this situation demands. The maintenance of fire during a severe blizzard requires skills that go far beyond simply adding fuel to existing flames. The wind creates downdrafts that can scatter burning embers throughout the lodge, while also creating updrafts that can pull all the heat up through the smoke hole before it has a chance to warm the interior space. She adjusts the configuration of the fuel constantly, creating barriers that protect the flames from wind while allowing enough air circulation to keep the fire burning cleanly. She monitors the smoke hole covering, adjusting it to balance the need for ventilation against the loss of heat and the intrusion of snow. She manages the placement of people and equipment around the fire to create the most efficient distribution of warmth, while ensuring that everyone has access to the light necessary for essential tasks. Hours pass in this rhythm. Story, fire tending, quiet consultation with her children about their needs and fears. The boy asks when his father will return, and Eagle Woman gives him the answer that preserves hope while acknowledging uncertainty. When the storm passes and travel becomes possible again, the hunters will find their way home. This response balances honesty about the situation with the reassurance that children need to maintain their emotional equilibrium during periods of stress. She explains that his father and the other hunters are experienced men who know how to find shelter and wait out severe weather, that they carry with them the knowledge and equipment necessary to survive even extended periods away from camp. She describes how hunters create emergency shelters using buffalo hides and natural windbreaks, how they can find food and fuel even in conditions that seem impossibly harsh to those without their specialized knowledge. But she also prepares him gradually for the possibility that the hunter's return might be delayed longer than originally expected, that the storm might create conditions that make travel dangerous or impossible for an extended period. She does this not to frighten him, but to help him develop the mental flexibility that will serve him throughout his life, the ability to hope for the best while preparing emotionally for more challenging possibilities. The girl, too young for complex explanations, simply wants to be held, and Eagle Woman cradles her while continuing her quiet work. The child's needs are more immediate and physical: warmth, food, the security of physical contact with her mother. But even at her young age, she responds to the emotional atmosphere around her, picking up on subtle cues that tell her whether the adults in her world are confident or anxious, prepared or overwhelmed. Eagle Woman's ability to project calm assurance while dealing with the practical challenges of storm survival provides a crucial foundation for her children's psychological well-being. The storm represents their first major crisis that they are old enough to perceive and remember, and their mother's response to it will influence how they approach challenges throughout their lives. Sometime deep in the night, when the storm has been raging for hours and shows no sign of diminishing, Eagle Woman hears a sound that makes her pause in her storytelling. A voice, barely audible over the wind, calling from somewhere outside the tipi. She listens intently, trying to determine if the sound is real or simply the wind playing tricks with her ears, creating phantom voices in its constant howling passage across the camp. The phenomenon of hearing voices in wind is well known to people who spend long periods in severe weather conditions. The mind, straining to make sense of the constant noise, begins to interpret random variations in pitch and rhythm as human speech. Experienced travelers learn to distinguish between these auditory illusions and actual human voices, but the distinction can be difficult to make when wind noise creates a constant background that masks and distorts all other sounds. The call comes again, closer now, and she recognizes it as a human voice in distress. The tone carries the unmistakable quality of someone in genuine trouble, not the controlled call of someone trying to communicate across a distance, but the desperate cry of someone whose situation has become life-threatening. The voice carries notes of exhaustion and panic that trigger immediate response in anyone who has learned to read the subtle indicators of crisis. Without hesitation, she wraps herself in her heaviest robe and pushes through the tipi flap into the full fury of the storm. The decision to leave the safety of her lodge represents considerable risk, but Eagle Woman's understanding of community responsibility makes the choice automatic. In the interconnected world of the winter camp, the death of any individual weakens the entire group, and the failure to respond to someone in distress violates fundamental principles that hold the community together. The cold hits her like a physical blow, and the wind-driven snow stings her exposed face like tiny needles. The temperature has dropped even further during the hours she spent inside, and now the air seems to burn her lungs with each breath. Her clothing, adequate for the protected environment inside the teepee, suddenly seems inadequate against the full force of the blizzard. She can barely see her own feet, let alone identify the source of the calls for help, but she knows that someone is out there in conditions that can kill within minutes. The visibility has dropped to zero, with snow falling so heavily and wind driving it so fiercely that objects only a few feet away become invisible. The familiar landmarks of the camp, lodge poles, equipment piles, the raised earth that marks fire pits, have all disappeared beneath a uniform layer of snow that eliminates all visual reference points. Following the sound, she makes her way carefully through the camp, using the lodge poles of familiar teepees as guides in the white chaos. Each step requires careful testing of the ground ahead, as the snow has filled in depressions and covered obstacles that could cause a fall. The lodge poles, normally reliable navigation markers, have become treacherous as wind and accumulating snow have changed their usual appearance and made them difficult to locate. The voice calls again, weaker now, and she realizes it is coming from the direction of the horse herd, where someone might have been caught while trying to bring the animals closer to camp for protection. The horses, normally kept on the periphery of the camp where they can graze and where their presence doesn't interfere with daily activities, require special attention during severe storms. They need windbreaks and access to water, and their survival often depends on human intervention during the worst weather. What she finds there will become part of her legend, though she herself will never speak of it as anything more than what any decent person would do in similar circumstances. A young man from a neighboring band, someone who had been visiting relatives in the camp when the storm began, has become lost in the blizzard while attempting to secure his horse. The animal has broken free and disappeared into the storm, and the young man, inadequately dressed for such conditions, is rapidly succumbing to the cold. The visitor's situation illustrates one of the constant challenges of Plains life, the presence in any camp of people who are not fully integrated into the community's survival systems. Visitors, traders, messengers, and others whose presence is temporary often find themselves vulnerable during crises because they lack the local knowledge and established relationships that community members depend on. Their survival becomes a test of the host community's commitment to the principles of hospitality and mutual aid that govern relationships between different groups. Eagle Woman finds him collapsed in a snowdrift, barely conscious, his exposed hands already showing the white patches that indicate frostbite beginning to set in. The signs of severe cold exposure are unmistakable to someone with her experience. The young man's skin has taken on the waxy appearance that precedes the complete loss of circulation in affected areas. His breathing has become shallow and irregular, indicating that his body is beginning to shut down non-essential functions in an attempt to preserve core temperature. Or his clothing, adequate for normal winter travel, has proven insufficient for the extreme conditions of the blizzard. His moccasins, designed for walking on frozen ground, have filled with snow that has melted and then refrozen, creating conditions that actually accelerate heat loss from his feet. His outer robe, suitable for moderate cold, has become saturated with snow and lost much of its insulating capacity. Without pausing to consider the danger to herself, she begins the process of getting him back to shelter, a task made immensely difficult by the conditions and by his inability to help in his own rescue. The young man's semi-conscious state means that he cannot walk or even support his own weight effectively. Eagle Woman must essentially carry someone larger than herself through snow that reaches above her knees, guided only by her intimate knowledge of the camp's layout and by a determination that will not accept the alternative. The rescue requires not just physical strength but tactical intelligence. Eagle Woman must find a route back to her tipi that avoids the obstacles and hazards that the storm has created while supporting the weight of someone who has lost the ability to coordinate his movements. She uses techniques learned through years of winter travel, testing each step before committing her full weight, using available landmarks to maintain direction, conserving her own energy for the sustained effort that the rescue requires. The journey back to her tipi, normally a matter of a few dozen steps, becomes an epic struggle against wind and cold, and the young man's increasing inability to move under his own power. Each step forward requires careful planning and execution. The wind seems to attack from every direction, trying to knock them off balance and separate them. The snow creates a constantly shifting surface that makes secure footing nearly impossible. Eagle Woman finds herself drawing on reserves of strength and endurance that she didn't know she possessed. The responsibility for another person's life creates a kind of desperate energy that allows her to continue long past the point where she would normally have sought shelter. The young man's survival depends entirely on her ability to get him to warmth and shelter before the cold completes its deadly work. By the time she gets him inside and begins the careful process of warming someone who has been on the edge of freezing to death, dawn is approaching, though the storm continues with undiminished fury. The process of treating severe cold exposure requires knowledge and skill that can make the difference between recovery and permanent injury or death. Warming must be done gradually to avoid shocking the body's systems. Circulation must be restored slowly to prevent the dangerous complications that can occur when frozen tissues are rewarmed too quickly. Her children watch with wide eyes as she strips away the young man's frozen clothing and wraps him in warm robes, as she feeds him small sips of warm broth and gradually brings feeling back to his extremities. The children's presence during this emergency provides them with their first direct experience of the life and death struggles that can characterize winter survival. They observe their mother's calm competence in the face of crisis, learning lessons about responsibility and community care that will influence their own behavior throughout their lives. The treatment of frostbite and hypothermia draws on medical knowledge that Eagle Woman has acquired through years of observation and instruction from the healers of her band. She knows that frozen tissue must be warmed slowly and gently, that circulation must be restored gradually to prevent permanent damage. She understands the signs that indicate whether treatment is succeeding or whether more drastic measures might be necessary. The young man's recovery unfolds slowly throughout the night and into the following day. His consciousness returns gradually, along with the pain that indicates sensation returning to previously frozen areas. Eagle Woman monitors his condition constantly, adjusting his treatment based on subtle changes in his breathing, skin color, and responsiveness. She administers medicinal teas prepared from her stores of healing plants, substances that can help his body recover from the trauma of severe cold exposure. This rescue will be talked about for years afterward, but Eagle Woman experiences it simply as one more challenge in a winter full of challenges, one more problem to be solved through careful attention and stubborn refusal to give up. Her response to the emergency reflects the values and training that have shaped her entire life, the automatic assumption that community members have obligations to help one another, the practical skills necessary to act effectively during crises, and the mental toughness required to persist in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The young man will recover completely and will carry the story of her courage back to his own people, where it will become part of the growing recognition that Eagle Woman possesses unusual gifts for leadership and diplomacy. But for now, she simply tends to one more person who needs care, adding him to the small community of survival that exists within the hide walls of her tipi. Outside, the storm continues to rage, but inside, around the fire that she has kept burning through the long night, there is warmth and safety and the quiet satisfaction of having done what needed to be done. The contrast between the chaos outside and the ordered sanctuary of the lodge interior represents more than just physical shelter. It embodies the human capacity to create islands of civilization and care in the midst of natural forces that remain indifferent to individual survival. The storm will eventually pass, as all storms do. The hunters will return, having survived their own adventures in the blizzard, with stories of emergency shelters constructed in creek bottoms and of game animals discovered in protected valleys where they had sought their own refuge from the weather. Life will resume its normal patterns of movement and seasonal adaptation, the rhythms of survival that have sustained the plains peoples for countless generations. But this winter and this storm will be remembered as the time when Eagle Woman first demonstrated the qualities that will make her one of the most respected mediators and leaders of her generation. The ability to see beyond immediate self-interest to the needs of the broader community, and the courage to act on that vision even when the cost is high and the outcome uncertain. As the grey light of a snow-filled dawn begins to filter through the teepee walls, Eagle Woman sits beside the fire, watching over the young man she rescued and listening to the steady breathing of her sleeping children. The storm still howls outside, but she has done what she could do, and that is enough. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve her people, new chances to bridge the gaps between survival and catastrophe that define life on the winter plains. The approaching dawn brings no immediate relief from the storm, but it does provide a psychological marker. The sense that time is passing, that the crisis will eventually end, that survival requires only the patience and endurance to outlast forces that cannot be fought directly. Eagle Woman uses these quiet hours before the camp awakens to assess the damage and begin the work of digging out, to plan for the day ahead, and to find within herself the reserves of strength that the continued challenges will require. But for now, for these quiet hours before the camp awakens to assess the damage and begin the work of digging out, she simply tends her fire and feels the deep satisfaction of having made it through another night in a world where such small victories are the foundation of all larger hopes. The fire itself has become a symbol of human persistence, the carefully maintained flame that represents the community's refusal to surrender to the forces that would extinguish both warmth and life. In the years that will follow, when Eagle Woman has become a figure of legendary status among her people and far beyond, storytellers will elaborate on this winter's events, adding details and meanings that transform a simple act of rescue into a mythic narrative about the qualities that define true leadership. But the essence of the story will always remain the same: a woman who understood that individual survival is meaningless without community survival, and who had the courage to act on that understanding when the test came in the form of a winter storm that revealed the true character of everyone it touched. As Eagle Woman's story fades into the gentle rhythm of falling snow, let us drift deeper into mysteries that archaeologists and engineers are still trying to understand. Imagine yourself floating upward, rising through the smoke hole of that winter teepee, ascending into the cold night air, where you can look down at the camp spread below like a collection of glowing cones against the endless white of the prairie. From this ethereal vantage point, you begin to see patterns that were invisible from ground level. The tipis are not randomly placed. Each one sits at a precise angle to the prevailing wind, each smoke hole aligned to catch the drafts that will draw smoke upward and out, each entrance facing the direction that provides the most protection from winter storms. This is not accident, but ancient engineering, knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood the physics of airflow and heat retention in ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. The placement itself reveals layers of sophisticated understanding. Notice how the largest family tipis anchor the windward side of the camp, their bulk creating a wind shadow that protects smaller structures behind them. The spacing between dwellings follows mathematical principles that optimize protection while allowing for the complex social interactions that sustain these communities through months of confinement. Each family's position in this winter constellation was determined not just by kinship and status, but by careful calculations of wind patterns, drainage, and the communal dynamics of shared survival. Settle yourself now into one of these mysterious structures, drifting down through the smoke hole like a curious spirit, and let your awareness expand to encompass the subtle genius of its construction. What you are experiencing is not simply shelter. It is a carefully orchestrated system of survival technologies that have been refined over centuries to provide maximum protection with minimum materials in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Begin with the foundation, though foundation is perhaps the wrong word for something so elegantly temporary. The tipi sits on nothing more than the earth itself, yet its stability comes from an understanding of geometric principles that would impress any modern architect. 15 lodge poles, each one selected for specific characteristics: straight grain, proper seasoning, the right balance between flexibility and strength, are arranged in a pattern that distributes weight and wind load with mathematical precision. The poles themselves tell a story that reaches back into the deep forests where they were born. These are not simply any trees cut for convenience, but carefully chosen specimens, often lodgepole pine or red cedar, harvested with ceremonies and gratitude, seasoned through multiple seasons until they achieve the perfect balance of properties needed for their task. Some of these poles will serve a family for decades, carried from camp to camp on specially designed travois, accumulating the patina of smoke and weather that marks them as treasured possessions. The selection process involved knowledge that spanned years of observation. Master pole cutters could identify suitable trees by examining the growth patterns that indicated internal grain structure, testing flexibility by observing how young trees responded to wind stress, and evaluating the resin content that would determine weathering characteristics. They understood that trees harvested during specific seasons would have different properties. Winter-cut poles possessed tighter grain and greater durability, while spring-harvested wood might be more flexible but less resistant to decay. Each pole was marked according to its intended position in the tipi structure. The primary tripod poles bore special markings, often carved symbols that indicated not just their structural role, but their spiritual significance in the family's cosmos. Secondary poles were ranked by strength and flexibility, with the most robust assigned to positions where wind stress would be greatest, and the most flexible reserved for locations where the structure needed to bend rather than break. The seasoning process itself was a marvel of patient engineering. Poles were not simply dried, but conditioned through exposure to specific environmental cycles. They might be buried in sand during summer months to slowly draw out moisture while preventing checking and cracking. Winter conditioning involved controlled exposure to freeze-thaw cycles that strengthened the wood fiber, while spring seasoning utilized the humidity variations that occurred as snow melted and vegetation renewed. Watch how they are arranged. The first 3 poles form a tripod of such precise geometry that it can stand unaided in winds that would topple less carefully engineered structures. The remaining 12 poles are added in a sequence that seems almost ritualistic, each one placed at angles that have been calculated through generations of experimentation to provide maximum stability with minimum materials. The result is a cone that flexes with the wind rather than fighting it, that sheds snow rather than collecting it, that channels air currents in ways that enhance rather than threaten the fire burning at its center. The geometric principles underlying this arrangement reveal mathematical sophistication that rivals modern engineering solutions. The tripod forms the foundation of what structural engineers would recognize as a tensegrity system, a framework that maintains its integrity through the balanced interaction of tension and compression forces. As additional poles are added, they create a network of mutual support where the failure of any single element is compensated by the redistribution of forces throughout the entire structure. The angle calculations involved in pole placement take into account not just static load distribution, but dynamic responses to environmental stresses. Wind loading creates complex force patterns that vary with direction and velocity, requiring pole arrangements that can adapt to changing conditions without losing structural integrity. Snow loading presents additional challenges, as the weight distribution changes constantly throughout winter storms, requiring a framework that can shed accumulating snow while maintaining its essential geometry. But the real mystery lies in the covering, those 12 buffalo hides that transform a simple wooden frame into a weatherproof shelter capable of maintaining livable temperatures even when the outside air drops far below zero. Look closely at how these hides are arranged, and you begin to see the accumulated wisdom of countless winter nights when survival depended on getting every detail exactly right. The preparation of these hides involved processes so complex that modern leatherworking techniques can barely replicate their properties. Each hide was selected for specific characteristics: thickness, flexibility, grain structure, and the particular qualities that would determine its behavior in extreme cold. Brain tanning processes created leather that remained supple at temperatures that would turn modern materials brittle and useless. The chemical composition of the tanning solutions involved combinations of materials that modern analysis suggests included not just brain tissue, but carefully prepared plant extracts, mineral compounds, and other substances that created leather with properties specifically optimized for Arctic conditions. The hides overlap in a pattern that sheds water while maintaining flexibility. Each seam is sewn with sinew in a way that actually becomes stronger when wet, creating joints that seal more tightly as moisture penetrates the outer layers. But most remarkably, the entire covering is designed to be adjusted constantly, loosened in warm weather to increase ventilation, tightened in storms to minimize heat loss, reconfigured as conditions change throughout the long winter months. The sinew used in these construction processes came from specific anatomical locations on buffalo, selected for particular mechanical properties. Backstrap sinew provided the strongest threads, capable of maintaining tension under extreme stress while expanding and contracting with temperature changes without losing grip. Leg sinew offered different properties, greater flexibility, and the ability to seal when wet, making it ideal for seams that needed to remain watertight while allowing structural movement. The sewing techniques themselves represented a form of textile engineering that created seams stronger than the materials they joined. Thread paths followed complex patterns that distributed stress across multiple points, preventing the catastrophic failures that could occur if a single puncture propagated into a larger tear. The spacing and tension of stitches were calculated to allow for the differential expansion and contraction of hide materials while maintaining structural integrity under the extreme temperature variations of prairie winters. Near the top of the tipi, 2 smoke flaps extend like ears from the main covering. These seemingly simple additions represent one of the most sophisticated ventilation systems ever devised for portable architecture. By adjusting the position of these flaps, the inhabitants can control not just the exit of smoke from their fire, but the entire pattern of air circulation within the structure. Open them one way and fresh air is drawn down the sides of the teepee to feed the fire, and then rises carrying smoke and moisture up and out. Adjust them differently, and the teepee becomes a sealed capsule that retains every bit of generated heat. The aerodynamic principles governing smoke flap operation involve understanding of fluid dynamics that would challenge modern engineers. The flaps function as variable geometry control surfaces that can be adjusted to create specific pressure differentials around the smoke hole. When positioned correctly, they create a Venturi effect that accelerates smoke removal while preventing downdrafts that could drive smoke back into the living space. The shape and size of the flaps were optimized through countless iterations of trial and error, resulting in configurations that work efficiently across a wide range of wind conditions and fire intensities. The control systems for these flaps involve mechanical, ingenious enough to operate from inside the teepee during severe weather. Pole arrangements allowed occupants to adjust flap positions without exposing themselves to outside conditions, using leverage systems that could overcome the wind forces acting on the flap surfaces. These control mechanisms were designed to be operated by feel in complete darkness, with tactile feedback systems that communicated flap position and wind conditions to experienced operators. But there are deeper mysteries here, engineering solutions so subtle that they are easily overlooked even by careful observers. Run your phantom fingers along the inner surface of the teepee wall and you will discover a second covering, a liner that hangs from the poles like an interior skin. This dew cloth, as it is sometimes called, creates an insulation space that traps warm air close to the living area while allowing the outer covering to breathe and shed moisture. The physics involved are complex. Warm air rises from the fire and spreads across the top of the interior space, then cools and descends along the outer walls, creating a circulation pattern that moves heat efficiently throughout the structure. Meanwhile, the space between the liner and the outer covering acts as a thermal barrier, much like the double walls of a modern thermos bottle. Cold air that penetrates the outer hide covering is warmed by contact with the heated inner air before it reaches the living space. This double wall system creates what modern engineers would recognize as a convective heat exchange mechanism. The airspace between liner and outer covering functions as a thermal buffer zone where heat transfer occurs through controlled convection rather than direct conduction. The result is a temperature gradient that prevents the formation of condensation on interior surfaces while maximizing heat retention within the living space. The liner itself was constructed using materials and techniques specifically designed to optimize this heat exchange process. The hides or fabricated materials used for dew cloths possess different properties from the outer covering, often thinner and more flexible, allowing them to conform closely to the interior framework while maintaining the precise air gaps needed for thermal efficiency. The attachment systems that secured these liners to the pole framework were designed to maintain proper spacing under varying temperature conditions, compensating for the expansion and contraction of materials as heating and cooling cycles occurred throughout the day and night. Even more mysterious are the substances used to weatherproof and insulate these remarkable structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that Plains peoples developed complex mixtures of materials to seal seams, waterproof hides, and provide additional insulation in extreme conditions. Traces of pine pitch mixed with charcoal and animal fat have been found in some excavations, creating a substance that could seal gaps while remaining flexible in extreme cold. Other sites have revealed evidence of what appeared to be specialized winter preparations, extra hides filled with dried grass or cattail down, creating primitive but effective insulation panels that could be added during the coldest months. The chemistry of these weatherproofing compounds reveals sophisticated understanding of material properties and chemical interactions. Pine pitch provided waterproofing and antiseptic qualities, while charcoal added structural stability and UV protection. Animal fats contributed flexibility and low-temperature performance, creating composite materials with properties specifically tailored to prairie winter conditions. The proportions and preparation methods for these compounds varied by region and family tradition, suggesting ongoing experimentation and refinement of formulations over generations. Some archaeological evidence points to the use of even more sophisticated material preparations. Traces of what appear to be protopolymers have been found at some sites, organic compounds that suggest deliberate chemical modifications of natural materials to enhance their performance characteristics. These substances show evidence of controlled fermentation processes that may have been used to modify the molecular structure of organic compounds, creating materials with enhanced water resistance, flexibility, or insulation properties. There are stories, passed down through oral tradition, of winter modifications so specialized that knowledge of them has been lost. Elderly informants in the early 20th century spoke of snow knives, tools designed to cut blocks of packed snow that could be arranged around the base of a tipi to create additional wind protection. Others describe techniques for building temporary windbreaks using combinations of snow, buffalo robes, and specially prepared poles that could provide extra protection during the most severe storms. These snow construction techniques involved understanding of snow properties that paralleled the sophisticated knowledge of Inuit builders. Different types of snow possess different structural characteristics. Wind-packed snow can be cut into blocks with considerable structural strength, while fresh powder snow requires different handling techniques to create effective barriers. The tools used for snow construction were specialized instruments designed for specific snow conditions with cutting edges and handling characteristics optimized for the precise operations required. The temporary windbreak systems described in oral histories suggest engineering approaches that combined multiple materials in integrated protective systems. Buffalo robes might be stretched between snow walls and specially prepared poles to create semi-enclosed spaces around teepee bases, providing additional protection during extreme weather events. These systems could be erected quickly as storms approached and dismantled when conditions improved, representing a level of rapid deployment engineering that allowed communities to respond dynamically to changing conditions. Consider the hearth itself, not just the fire, but the entire system designed to maximize heat production while minimizing fuel consumption. The fire pit at the center of the teepee is not randomly placed, but positioned to optimize heat distribution and smoke evacuation. Stones are arranged around it in patterns that store and radiate heat long after the flames have died down. The floor around the fire is often lined with specially prepared materials that insulate the occupants from the frozen ground while reflecting heat upward into the living space. The thermal engineering of these hearth systems reveals understanding of heat transfer principles that encompasses conduction, convection, and radiation. The positioning of the fire pit takes into account the geometry of the interior space to maximize radiant heating while ensuring proper combustion air supply. The stone arrangements function as thermal mass systems, absorbing heat during active burning periods and releasing it gradually as ambient temperatures drop, creating a thermal flywheel effect that extends heating efficiency throughout the night. The stones themselves were selected for specific thermal properties. Certain types of rock possess superior heat storage capacity, while others are chosen for their ability to withstand thermal cycling without cracking or fragmenting. The arrangement patterns optimize surface area exposure to maximize heat transfer while creating air circulation paths that enhance convective heating. Some archaeological sites reveal evidence of sophisticated stone heating systems that may have included arrangements for heating stones externally and transferring them to interior locations, creating auxiliary heating systems for extreme weather conditions. Some archaeological sites have revealed traces of what appear to be sophisticated heating systems, networks of small channels dug beneath the tipi floor that may have been used to circulate warm air from the central fire to sleeping areas around the perimeter. If such systems actually existed, they would represent a level of engineering sophistication that challenges common assumptions about the technological capabilities of nomadic peoples. These underground heating systems, if they existed as described, would represent remarkable innovations in portable heating technology. The excavation of circulation channels that could be effective yet easily filled and restored when camps moved would require sophisticated understanding of soil properties, drainage, and thermal dynamics. The engineering challenges involved in creating temporary ductwork systems using available materials would have demanded considerable ingenuity and technical skill. The evidence for such systems remains fragmentary and controversial among archaeologists, but the theoretical principles underlying their operation are sound. Underground air circulation could provide radiant floor heating while reducing fuel consumption and improving air quality within the living space. The technical challenges of implementing such systems in temporary structures would have included sealing techniques, insulation methods, and air circulation management that represent considerable engineering achievements. But perhaps the deepest mystery lies not in the physical engineering of these structures, but in the cultural knowledge that made their construction possible. Each tipi was traditionally erected by the women of the family, and the process required not just technical skill but profound understanding of materials, weather patterns, and the subtle environmental factors that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. This knowledge was passed down through generations in ways that went far beyond simple instruction. Young girls learned by watching and helping, gradually absorbing the intuitive understanding needed to read the landscape, predict weather changes, and adapt their shelter systems to constantly changing conditions. They learned to feel the tension in lodge poles that indicated proper alignment, to recognize the sounds that meant their covering was beginning to loosen in the wind, to sense the air currents that warned of approaching storms. The educational processes that transmitted this technical knowledge represented sophisticated systems of skill development and quality control. Master builders developed training sequences that gradually introduced complexity while ensuring that critical safety and performance principles were thoroughly understood. The learning process extended over many years, with different aspects of construction knowledge introduced, as students demonstrated readiness to handle increasingly complex responsibilities. Assessment of competence involved not just technical proficiency, but judgment and intuition that could only be developed through extensive experience. Expert practitioners could diagnose structural problems through subtle visual and tactile cues, predict weather-related challenges from environmental signs, and modify construction techniques in response to unique local conditions. This level of expertise represented the culmination of knowledge systems that had been refined over generations of continuous use and improvement. Much of this knowledge has been lost, and what remains exists often as fragments, partial memories preserved by elders whose own childhood experiences of traditional winter camping may have been limited by the disruptions of the late 19th century. Archaeologists working at winter campsites on the northern plains sometimes find evidence of techniques and materials that they cannot fully interpret, remnants of knowledge systems that were developed over centuries and perfected through countless winters of testing against the most demanding conditions imaginable. The process of knowledge loss occurred rapidly during the period of cultural disruption, as traditional lifestyles were abandoned and younger generations lost opportunities to gain hands-on experience with traditional techniques. What survives often exists as isolated fragments, specific technical details preserved by individual practitioners, but lacking the comprehensive understanding that made the complete systems effective. Modern reconstruction efforts, despite careful attention to documented techniques and materials, often fall short of achieving the performance levels described in historical accounts. This suggests that the missing elements may include Not just specific technical knowledge, but the integrated understanding that allowed expert practitioners to optimize their techniques based on subtle environmental and material variations that are difficult to document or teach through formal instruction. The mysteries go deeper still. Some archaeological sites contain evidence of what appear to be ceremonial or spiritual elements integrated into winter shelter construction. Specially prepared objects buried beneath hearthstones, arrangements of materials that seem to follow patterns with possible religious significance, traces of substances that may have been used in rituals designed to ensure the shelter's protective power. These findings suggest that for the peoples who developed these remarkable survival technologies, the distinction between practical engineering and spiritual practice may not have existed in the way modern minds understand it. The construction and maintenance of winter shelters may have been seen as acts that required not just technical skill, but proper spiritual preparation and ongoing ritual attention. The integration of ceremonial elements into construction practices may have served practical purposes beyond their spiritual significance. Ritual activities that ensured careful attention to critical construction details would have functioned as quality control systems, while ceremonial validation of materials and techniques may have provided community oversight of safety and performance standards. The spiritual aspects of construction may thus have been integral to the technical success of these systems rather than separate from their engineering functions. Archaeological evidence of ritual preparation includes specialized tools that appear to have been used exclusively in construction ceremonies, prepared spaces where materials were blessed or treated before use, and arrangements of objects that suggest specific protocols for ensuring proper construction procedures. These elements suggest that shelter construction was embedded within broader cultural frameworks that provided both spiritual meaning and practical reliability for these essential survival technologies. Modern recreations of traditional tipis, even those built with careful attention to historical accuracy, often fail to achieve the level of performance described in historical accounts. Contemporary builders may understand the basic principles of construction, but they lack the accumulated wisdom that came from generations of refinement, the intuitive knowledge that allowed expert practitioners to adapt and modify their techniques based on subtle environmental cues that are difficult to document or teach. The gap between modern reconstructions and historical performance suggests that the traditional knowledge systems included elements that are not captured in written documentation or archaeological evidence. These might include subtle material preparation techniques, environmental assessment skills, construction timing considerations, or maintenance practices that were considered so fundamental that they were never explicitly documented. The seasonal timing of various construction activities may have been critical to achieving optimal performance, but difficult to reconstruct from fragmentary historical evidence. The preparation of materials, selection of sites, and execution of construction may have required precise coordination with environmental conditions that modern builders cannot easily identify or replicate. What remains is a sense of mystery, a recognition that these seemingly simple structures represented one of humanity's most successful adaptations to extreme environmental conditions. In an age when survival often depended on technology that could be carried on the back of a horse, transported across vast distances, and erected quickly in the face of approaching storms, the Plains peoples developed shelters that provided not just protection but genuine comfort in conditions that would challenge the best modern equipment. The comparison between traditional tipi performance and modern equipment capabilities reveals the remarkable efficiency of these traditional systems. Contemporary Arctic gear, despite the benefits of synthetic materials and modern manufacturing, often cannot match the combination of portability, durability, and environmental performance achieved by traditional hide and pole construction. The weight-to-performance ratios of traditional systems remain superior to most modern alternatives, while their repairability and adaptability provide advantages that high-tech equipment cannot match. The economic efficiency of these traditional systems is equally remarkable. The materials and labor required to construct and maintain winter shelters represented sustainable resource use that could be maintained indefinitely without depleting environmental resources or requiring external supply chains. The complete life cycle costs of traditional shelter systems, when properly calculated, demonstrate efficiency levels that modern systems rarely achieve. As you drift through this phantom exploration of winter tipi engineering, surrounded by the gentle sounds of wind through hide walls and the soft crackling of a carefully tended fire, you begin to understand that you are experiencing something far more sophisticated than primitive camping. You are inside one of humanity's most elegant solutions to the challenge of creating home in a world that seems designed to prevent it, surrounded by technologies so perfectly adapted to their purpose that they seem less like human inventions than natural phenomena. The sensory environment within a properly constructed winter tipi reveals additional layers of engineering sophistication. The acoustic properties of hide walls create sound environments that enhance communication while providing privacy, filtering external noise while allowing occupants to monitor environmental conditions outside. The visual environment created by firelight filtered through hide creates lighting conditions that optimize night vision while providing psychological comfort during long winter evenings. The air quality management achieved by traditional ventilation systems maintains breathable atmosphere while controlling humidity, preventing the condensation problems that plague many modern shelters in extreme cold conditions. The temperature regulation systems create microclimates that can vary by function. Sleeping areas maintained at different temperatures from work areas, with transition zones that allow occupants to adapt gradually to external conditions when leaving the shelter. The fire burns lower now, casting dancing shadows on walls that have been engineered to hold warmth while allowing the structure to breathe, to flex, to adapt to conditions that change moment by moment throughout the long winter night. Outside, the endless prairie stretches away under its blanket of snow, but here, in this small cone of carefully orchestrated comfort, the ancient arts of survival continue their quiet work, maintaining the delicate bubble of life that makes human presence possible in one of Earth's most challenging environments. This final image of the dying fire illuminates the essential truth about these remarkable structures. They represent technology in its purest form, human ingenuity applied with such skill and understanding that the result achieves a kind of perfection that transcends its material components. In the gentle interplay of firelight and shadow, the profound wisdom of generations continues to manifest itself, creating spaces where human life can flourish, even in the face of conditions that would otherwise make survival impossible. The mystery endures, challenging modern understanding and inviting continued exploration of what these remarkable achievements can teach us about the relationship between human ingenuity and environmental adaptation. In an age of increasing environmental uncertainty, the lessons embedded in these ancient technologies may prove more valuable than we yet realize, offering insights into sustainable living practices that our modern world desperately needs to rediscover. As our phantom journey through tipi mysteries dissolves like morning mist, let us drift now toward the edges of this winter world, where different forms of shelter cast different shadows on the snow, and where the democracy of cold reveals itself in subtle hierarchies of comfort and vulnerability. Picture yourself floating across the frozen landscape to where the Missouri River cuts a dark line through the white prairie. Here, rising from the riverbank like wooden fortresses against the endless sky, stand the trading posts: Fort Union, Fort Pierre, Fort Laramie, names that will echo through the history of the American West. But tonight, in this winter of the 1840s, they are simply islands of a different kind of warmth in the same ocean of cold that surrounds the tipi camps. Inside the thick log walls of Fort Pierre, a different drama of winter survival unfolds. The chief trader, a man named Honoré Picot, whose mixed French and Dakota heritage allows him to move between worlds, sits before a cast-iron stove that glows like a mechanical sun in the main room of his quarters. The stove itself is a marvel of industrial engineering shipped up the Missouri River from St. Louis, 2,000 miles of water transport that brought this concentration of warmth to the edge of the world. Yet even here, surrounded by log walls 2 feet thick and heated by the most advanced technology the 1840s could provide, comfort remains relative. Picot can see his breath in the corners of the room where the stove's heat fails to reach. Ice forms on the inside of the shuttered windows, and the wind finds gaps between the chinked logs that allow tiny streams of Arctic air to probe the interior like searching fingers. His evening meal, salt pork, hardtack biscuits, coffee made from beans carried up from New Orleans, represents luxuries that would seem miraculous to the families huddled in their tipis just a few miles away. But it also represents a different kind of vulnerability. Where Eagle Woman's people can pack their entire world onto travois and move toward better hunting or more sheltered valleys, Picot is anchored to this single spot by thousands of dollars worth of trade goods, by the massive infrastructure needed to maintain connection with the distant commercial centers that supply his needs. The fort stores contain wonders that demonstrate the vast networks of trade beginning to reshape the continent. Woolen blankets from mills in Massachusetts, iron kettles from Pennsylvania foundries, glass beads from Venice, silk ribbons from France, all carried by steamboat and keelboat and overland freight wagon to this remote outpost where they will be exchanged for buffalo robes and beaver pelts that will, in turn, journey back down the river to markets in St. Louis and New York and London. But this cornucopia of goods cannot solve the fundamental problem of winter on the northern plains. When the temperature drops to 30 below zero and the wind sweeps across the prairie with nothing to break its force, even the most sophisticated shelter becomes a fragile bubble of temporary comfort. Picot's stove consumes enormous quantities of wood, entire trees that must be cut from the increasingly distant groves along the river, hauled by ox-drawn sledges across snow that sometimes reaches to the animals' bellies. The fort's inhabitants, perhaps 30 men ranging from French voyageurs to American clerks to mixed-blood interpreters, huddle around that single source of heat like moths around a flame. The hierarchy of the trading post is reflected in their proximity to warmth. Picot and his senior associates closest to the stove, clerks and laborers arranged in a careful social geography that places the newest arrivals and the least valued workers in the drafty periphery, where comfort fades into mere survival. Yet even this relative luxury comes with costs that the tipi dwellers never face. The fort's residents are dependent on supply lines that stretch across half a continent, vulnerable to disruptions that can leave them isolated for months at a time. If the last steamboat of the season fails to arrive with winter provisions, if war or economic panic disrupts the flow of goods from eastern factories, the inhabitants of these supposed havens of civilization can find themselves worse off than their native neighbors who carry their entire support system with them in the form of accumulated knowledge and portable skills. Now let your awareness drift back across the snowy landscape to the native camps, but focus this time on the subtle gradations of comfort and status that exist even within the apparent uniformity of tipi life. Not all lodge covers are created equal. Not all families face the winter with the same resources or the same prospects for survival. Near the center of the camp circle, where the most honored families traditionally place their dwellings, stands a tipi that is noticeably larger than the others around it. This is the lodge of a war chief whose reputation and spiritual power have earned him a position of leadership that translates into very real material advantages. His tipi uses perhaps 18 poles instead of the more common 15, and its covering requires nearly 20 buffalo hides instead of 12. The difference in size means more room for his extended family, more space for the ceremonial objects that mark his status, and more volume of air to be heated by his fire, but it also means that his family has access to more resources and more help in gathering the materials needed for winter survival. Inside this larger lodge, the chief's wives, for he has two, a mark of his ability to support multiple families, work with materials that reflect their household's prosperity. Their winter moccasins are decorated with porcupine quill work of exceptional quality, dyed in colors that come from trade with distant tribes. Their children wear fur-lined caps made from the pelts of rare animals taken during successful hunting expeditions. Their store of winter food includes not just pemmican and dried meat, but also treats that speak of abundance. Maple sugar, obtained through trade with woodland peoples to the east, dried corn from agricultural tribes to the south, even small quantities of wild rice that has traveled hundreds of miles from the lake country of what will someday be Minnesota. But the chief's greatest luxury is not material. It is the buffer of security that comes from his position in the network of reciprocal obligations that holds Plains society together. When other families face shortages, they can appeal to his generosity and expect help. When his own family needs assistance, that help flows back to him, multiplied by his many relationships and alliances. His status is both a responsibility and an insurance policy, a form of wealth that provides protection against the uncertainties that can destroy less well-connected families. Yet even this elevated position cannot shield him completely from winter's democratic assault. When the blizzards rage and the temperature drops beyond the reach of any fire, the chief's children breathe the same cold air, sleep on the same frozen ground, wake to the same frost-covered walls as the children of the humblest families in the camp. His larger tipi may provide more space, but it also presents more surface area from which heat can escape, more hide seams through which wind can penetrate. His abundance of food stores must be balanced against the greater number of people who depend on his household for support. The true elite of this winter world are not necessarily those with the most possessions, but those with the most knowledge, the elderly women whose accumulated wisdom about weather patterns, food preservation, and medical treatment makes them invaluable to the community's survival. These grandmothers may live in modest tipis with few material luxuries, but their advice is sought by war chiefs and trading post factors alike. They know which plants can ease a fever, which signs predict a change in weather, which techniques can extend the life of dwindling food supplies. One such woman, whose Lakota name translates roughly as knows the winter, sits tonight in a teepee that would seem unremarkable from the outside. But inside, hanging from the lodge poles in carefully labeled bundles, is a pharmacy that represents decades of gathering and preparation. Here are roots that can ease the respiratory problems that kill children in cold weather, leaves that can be brewed into teas to strengthen the blood, seeds that provide essential nutrients when other foods run short. Her knowledge extends beyond medicine to encompass the full range of survival skills that make winter life possible. She knows how to read the behavior of animals to predict storms, how to adjust teepee construction for different wind conditions, how to prepare foods that will remain edible for months without spoiling. This knowledge makes her wealthy in ways that transcend material possessions. Her advice can mean the difference between life and death, and that gives her a form of power that no amount of trade goods can match. But wealth and status in this harsh world prove fragile in ways that would astonish more settled societies. A successful hunting season can elevate a family from poverty to prosperity in a matter of weeks. A single blizzard can destroy the horse herd that represents a lifetime of careful accumulation. A disease outbreak can level the social hierarchy in days, reducing chiefs to beggars and elevating the humble to leadership positions based purely on their ability to survive and help others do the same. The winter of 1849 provides a stark example of this fragility. A particularly severe series of storms strikes the northern plains in February, lasting for nearly 3 weeks and bringing temperatures that remain below zero for days at a time. When the weather finally clears, the social landscape of many camps has been dramatically altered. Families that began the winter in comfortable circumstances find themselves destitute, their horse herds dead, their food stores exhausted. Others, whose careful preparation and conservative resource management seemed overly cautious in the autumn, emerge as the new providers for communities that must reorganize themselves around whoever has managed to retain the means of survival. In the trading posts, the same democratic brutality of extreme cold exposes the limitations of supposedly superior technology. The cast-iron stoves that seemed so reliable in milder weather crack when the temperature differential between their glowing interiors and the sub-zero air becomes too extreme. The thick log walls that provided such confidence against ordinary winter weather prove inadequate when the cold reaches levels that make metal brittle and wood shrink away from its fastenings. Fort Pierre loses 2 men to the cold during this period, not to dramatic accidents or heroic expeditions, but to the simple miscalculation of stepping outside inadequately dressed for a task that should have taken only minutes. Their bodies are found within sight of the fort's walls, victims of conditions so extreme that the few dozen yards between safety and death might as well have been miles. Yet in the native camps, where the margins of survival seem so much thinner, the casualty rates are often lower. The tipi dwellers' intimate knowledge of their environment, their sophisticated understanding of the signs that precede dangerous weather, their social systems designed around mutual support, all of these factors combine to create resilience that no individual wealth or technological advantage can match. The lesson that emerges from this winter, and from countless others like it, is that in the face of truly extreme conditions, survival depends less on the accumulation of advantages than on the wisdom to live within the constraints that nature imposes. The trading post factor with his cast-iron stove may be more comfortable on an ordinary winter evening, but he is also more vulnerable to disruptions in the complex systems that maintain his comfort. The war chief, with his larger teepee and abundant stores, may live more luxuriously than his followers, but he is also burdened with greater responsibilities and exposed to greater risks. In the end, it is often the most humble members of the winter communities who prove most adaptable, most capable of finding warmth and nourishment and meaning in conditions that defeat those who have grown dependent on elaborate systems of support. The elderly grandmother with her modest teepee but vast knowledge, the young mother who has learned to read weather signs and stretch food supplies, the quiet hunter who understands animal behavior and the subtle rhythms of the winter landscape, these are the people who not only survive but maintain the cultural knowledge that allows entire communities to persist in one of the world's most challenging environments. As dawn approaches and the long winter night begins to fade toward grey morning light, the various forms of shelter across this frozen landscape, tipis and trading posts, humble lodges and elaborate dwellings, all face the same test of endurance against conditions that recognize no human hierarchies. The wind blows equally through the gaps in chinked logs and sewn hide seams. The cold penetrates cast-iron stoves and buffalo chip fires with the same relentless persistence. In the face of such forces, the distinctions between civilization and wilderness, between wealth and poverty, between power and vulnerability, prove as ephemeral as breath visible in the frigid air. What endures is simpler and more fundamental, the human capacity to adapt, to share, to find warmth in one another's presence when the world outside offers nothing but hostile indifference. In teepee and trading post alike, people huddle closer to their fires and to each other, creating small islands of life and warmth that persist not because of their strength, but because of their flexibility, not because they can defeat winter, but because they have learned to dance with it, to bend without breaking, to find comfort in the knowledge that even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn. As our long winter night draws toward its close and the first pale suggestion of dawn begins to touch the eastern horizon, let us gather the threads of this quiet journey through time and see what patterns they weave together. You have walked in moccasins, stiff with frost across ground hard as stone. You have felt the bite of wind that finds every gap in buffalo hide and wool blanket, that turns breath to crystal and makes each step a small victory against forces that seem determined to reclaim the prairie for silence and cold. You have sat beside fires that represent the difference between life and death, tended with the careful attention that such responsibilities deserve. You have seen how Eagle Woman moved through her world with the quiet grace of someone who understood that survival was never a solitary achievement, but always a community effort requiring patience, generosity, and the wisdom to see beyond immediate needs to longer patterns of reciprocity and care. Her story echoes across the generations, reminding us that leadership in the hardest times often looks less like commanding and more like serving, less like accumulating power, and more like accepting responsibility. You have drifted through the mysterious engineering of shelters that seem impossibly fragile from the outside, but prove remarkably sophisticated from within. Structures that embody centuries of accumulated wisdom about wind and weather, about the physics of heat and the psychology of comfort, in spaces small enough to heat with burning chips of dried buffalo dung. And you have witnessed how the democracy of extreme cold revealed both the fragility of privilege and the deep resilience of communities organized around sharing rather than hoarding, around knowledge rather than possessions, around the understanding that in the face of forces larger than any individual will, survival depends on our ability to care for one another. These lessons from the winter world of the northern plains speak to something deeper than historical curiosity. They remind us of capabilities we still carry within ourselves, the ability to find warmth in community when the world seems cold and hostile, to discover comfort in simple things when complex systems fail us, to maintain hope and humanity in conditions that test the limits of endurance. The people whose lives we have shared tonight were not superhuman. They felt cold as sharply as we would, feared hunger and loss and the long darkness of winter nights that seemed to stretch toward eternity. But they had learned something that our more comfortable world sometimes forgets, that the things we most need for survival are often not the things we can buy or build, but the things we can share. Knowledge passed down through generations, skills that live in practiced hands, the quiet courage to keep fires burning when everything depends on that small circle of light and warmth. As you settle into the comfort of your own bed tonight, perhaps you can carry with you some echo of that ancient wisdom. Feel the weight of blankets that you have never had to weave from buffalo hide. Breathe air warmed by systems so reliable you rarely think of them. Rest on surfaces that never require you to arrange dried grass for insulation against frozen ground. But also remember the deeper comforts that transcend technology, the warmth that comes from knowing you are part of a community that would not abandon you to the cold, the security that comes from possessing skills and knowledge that no storm can destroy, the quiet satisfaction that comes from tending to the small responsibilities that keep life possible for yourself and those you care about. The winter world of the Plains peoples has largely vanished now, swept away by the great changes that reshaped the continent in the 19th century. The buffalo herds that made that life possible are mostly gone, the vast grasslands transformed by agriculture and settlement, the seasonal rhythms of nomadic life replaced by the fixed patterns of towns and cities, and the complex technologies of industrial civilization. But on quiet winter nights like this one, when the wind still blows across the prairie with something of its ancient voice, when snow still falls on landscapes that remember older ways of living, The wisdom of those winter survivors whispers through the darkness, reminding us of truths that no amount of technological progress can entirely erase. We are still, at the deepest level, the same people who learned to make homes in hostile places, to find warmth in one another's presence, to keep small fires burning against the great dark cold of an indifferent universe. We still carry within ourselves the capacity for the patience, courage, and mutual care that made survival possible in the harshest conditions our species has ever faced. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in warmth and safety that those winter people could hardly have imagined, you can rest secure in the knowledge that their strength lives on in you, that their wisdom has been passed down through countless generations and countless winters, and that somewhere in the genetic memory of our shared humanity, we still remember how to tend the fires that matter most. Sleep well, and dream perhaps of vast prairies under starlit snow, of the quiet voices around winter fires, of the endless human story of finding light and warmth and meaning in a world that offers no guarantees except the promise that spring, however distant it may seem, will always eventually return to a world patient enough to wait for its arrival. The wind subsides now, and in the growing quiet, all that remains is the soft rhythm of your breathing, the gentle sound of warmth settling around you like a buffalo robe, and the ancient lullaby of winter nights that have always, in the end, given way to peaceful sleep and the promise of morning light. Rest now. The long winter night is ending, and you have learned something of how to survive it, with grace, with dignity, and with the quiet knowledge that even in the deepest cold, human warmth endures. And that is enough. And that has always been enough. And that will always be enough. I'm grateful you spent this time with me tonight. I upload soft, slow history stories nearly every day, so there's always another waiting for you. Tap subscribe if you'd like to keep these gentle journeys close. Rest easy, friend.